And we're rolling. Okay, for real this time. Hi, thank you for being here. We're talking about Principle 3. Now I know it's this one. It's like Groundhog Day. For how to win friends and influence people. Principle 3 is arousing in the person an eager wants. I'm speaking here with Robbie Holmes, who is the digital service expert, and you work with the United States Digital Services. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Sure. I am Robbie the Geek everywhere online. I have 23 years of experience across lots of different industries. I started in IT where I worked for New York City and New York State in the welfare system. So I worked for the Department of Social Services and I worked for the Human Resources Administration. I started as a phone support person and eventually became the Network Operations Center Manager for the City of New York. And then at the time transitioned from being a IT person to being a developer. During that time, I definitely didn't feel like I was smart enough to be a programmer. And I feel like over time of supporting programmers, I realized maybe I am smart enough. Maybe I can do that. So then started building websites and stuff like that. And that transitioned me with connections through community, going out to events where I was lucky enough to get a job where I worked at Sony Music, where I managed the platform for all the artist websites. And that led me through from there to Zagat Survey, where I then eventually got acquired by Google. So I worked at Google for 2.5 years as a web developer, and then eventually left there and I went to Johnson & Johnson, where I built a platform team for all the consumer-facing websites, so Tylenol.com and all of their other brands.
NBD.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a couple of sites. And then the end of that led to me to becoming a director of engineering for a small team at IDT Telecommunications, the Special Projects Division, where a friend of mine wanted to bring in modern best practices and felt like I would be a good fit. And then I worked for Phase 2, which is right here in Alexandria, where I worked on large-scale websites and platforms. And then eventually saw a blog post about the United States Digital Service. And I read this blog post about a group of people who were Obama's geeks or the startup inside the White House. And I felt like it seemed an awful lot like personality types that aligned with me. I felt like I've often been the person in my job who cared about why we were doing something or who we were doing it for and if it was going to help them. And I read about the work that was being done by the USDS, and it felt like it was a possibility that this group of people was aligned with my goals and the things I cared about. And I feel really lucky to have been a part of that.
And you know, that's part of the way we met was you gave a talk on imposter syndrome, and you know, EQ is such a big part of that. And we ended up meeting later on at a local coffee shop, and you'd already read this book. So I think it's amazing that, you know, having worked with a lot of techies and engineers, and you don't get a lot of folks who care as much about the human side of things, and that's just such an essential sort of component of you know, working with people, but also developing products and kind of understanding all that EQ. So, and also I think the fact that you'd already read this book and sort of broken it down in a lot of different ways was one reason why I was like, I have to get you on this you know, talk here to discuss this. So, you know, I'd like to hear from you how, you know, the principle we're talking about is arousing in the person an eager want, and how that sort of shows up in the different aspects of what you've done.
So I can talk about, like, so from my perspective, when I worked at Sony, that's probably the first time I experienced that, I would say. My manager, Susie Arnold, was a good friend of mine from the tech community in New York. So we were both a member of the Drupal community in NYC. And when I ended up getting reached out to see whether or not I was in the market for a job. We ended up having coffee, and that was our interview process, where she was just like, I just want to come and chat. I know you're good at what you do. And what was really good about that is every conversation we had was about how we were going to solve the problem. And I feel like I was always a part of the team. So whether or not that was like one of the first modeling I had for that type of management. And I feel like it's the kind of thing where we would have lots of conversations, whether they were scheduled or not, where it was just her and I having a conversation, whether it was over a cup of coffee or over a drink, but like we would talk on a regular basis. Also, I was like her right hand. So we sat right next to one another and we had these ongoing conversations on a regular basis. And I feel like it was the communication that we had that allowed me to feel connected to the work we were doing and about how we were going to move forward. And it was always about us. It was about the team. Yeah. And I feel like that really influenced the way that I eventually became a manager. and the way that I have actually been a tech leader on teams.
Yeah.
If you move forward to times where I've been, what I used to talk about when I was in the market for a job and talking to tech recruiters was, I will be one of those people that will make your team 25% better inherently by having me on it, because I will make all of your engineers feel heard. I will also be able to evaluate where they are and make sure that their feelings are covered. And that's the kind of thing that's really hard to talk about on your resume. Like being able to say that and then quantify it is near impossible. But like 25% is just an estimate. Like I think the reality is I'm going to pay attention to your engineers. They're going to feel heard and they're going to feel like they are a part of the team because of the way that I was brought up through this process.
Yeah. Have you, you're just making me think of that article, the No Stats All-Star about Shane Battier, written by Michael Lewis, and how he amplifies the other teammates, but he's not necessarily the things that he's good at. He's not like, he doesn't necessarily a scorer, but he like mitigates the best players on the other team, and he amplifies everyone. Kind of taking this in a little bit of a different direction. Do you think it's possible that everyone on your team, like if everyone on the team was like that, do you think the amplification effect would?
Yeah, so I feel like one of the things I did, I can give a direct example. When I worked at the Department of Veterans Affairs as part of the USDS, I was the team lead for the core team. So we ended up working on vets.gov, which was a project having to do with consolidating down like 400-ish websites into one interface for veterans to interact with the VA. And there were like 6 different logins. So we were trying to come down to a single sign-on, or at least a way for people to sign on with what they currently have.
Love that.
And in the end, what was really nice was I had a team full of people with different levels of experience, and each one of them, so what's great is the project that we were working on was actually built in Ruby on Rails, and I do not consider myself a Ruby on Rails expert. I consider myself Ruby on Rails tolerant. It's not my favorite tech stack, but I also feel like I understand why we use it. And I have done enough projects in Rails that I feel confident that I can write the code, but I can also make sure that we're applying best practices because I understand how the framework works. But there were people on my team that were significantly more experienced with Rails, but less experienced in their careers. So initially it was really funny having these one-on-ones with people and just being like, you know more about this technology than I do. And also still remaining in a leadership role by talking through how we solve problems and not the explicit way. So I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time with, and one of the ways that I approach things, is that I feel like at the beginning of a project, I often will, I know I cast a big wake, I'm a big personality, so the way I start off projects usually is to sort of take ownership as the lead of a project that we're going to get it accomplished. And then over time, I slowly transition to, as we're breaking down the features and we're landing things, trying to put individuals on the team out as subject matter experts. So I can start at the very beginning about like, rah, we're going to do a thing. And then as we start doing the thing, I can be like, rah, Heather built this piece. You should ask Heather, and then ask, by going through one-on-ones with Heather and making sure that she's prepared as we go through this process, that she can feel confident that she's going to be able to talk about this, and also giving them coping mechanisms for when they're not confident. So like, I am happy to back channel you if I have more information, if you are able to multitask. If not, just saying like, I will look into this and get back to you, or we'll talk about it at the next meeting. I will make sure I put that on the presentation. Like giving people the path for how they can actually talk about something if they're not confident is a big one. The other one I would talk about is while I was there, we went through this process where we had 3 teams that were developing separately to build the back end. And the problem was these teams were not communicating. So what we, as the leaders, started talking about was we're having a serious communication problem. So we talked about possible ways to solve this. And it was like, do we force them to talk to one another? Do we force them to demo their projects to one another? In the end, I came to the consensus with the leads that I think we should actually force them to all develop in the same code base. So I actually believe in microservice architecture, which is where we were going, but I felt like for this team at the time, it was more important that they communicate. So I had to take on the opposite role, almost play devil's advocate, to push us towards a monolith and building everything in a single repository. And there was very strong conversation that led us. So we had an actual debate across the whole team, and I had individual conversations with everyone on my team and a bunch of other people on other teams to understand where they stood and explain the whys of why I thought we might end up in this place. But I never once said we're going to build a monolith. I was like, how do you feel about this? Why do you feel about it? And then I would give explanations from the other perspective. So even if it was a person who said monolith, I would say, well, you should also think about these aspects of why microservices might be better, but get everybody to a consensus where I think I knew going into the final conversation where we were going to land, because I had actually spent a bunch of time talking with people and building consensus across the team. And I think that was really important. So in the end, the person that I put, so we had the conversation, we made the decision to move to a monorail, a monolith inside of Rails. And it was not what the whole team wanted, but it was what the whole team ended up agreeing to. And the person that I put in charge of the actual building of that monorail, bringing everything in from those 3 projects, was somebody who was really into the microservices architecture and disagreed with the monolith. But we had lots of conversations, and in the end he agreed because I actually opened up to him about the communications problem. And that, because of my vulnerability of why we were doing it and talking about the underlying motivation of what I was hoping to accomplish, he agreed, and that in him created a want or an understanding of why it was better for the team to do what we were talking about. And it wasn't about manipulating, it was about hearing everybody out, because we could have gotten to the final solution and make people communicate if we had come up with a path. But in my opinion, this was the shortest path forward for 3 teams to actually start communicating.
Yeah, there's a lot there. One of the things I really like, we've had a few conversations now about this, in your management style, and part of engendering it, this eager want, is this personalization, this one-on-one conversations with folks. Being able to read their body language and talk to them in person, like now. I think that's huge, and I think that's something I really admire. Something else I was hearing as you were talking, I was trying to listen. That's one of the rules. Is I like that your management style isn't necessarily you judging them, like you telling them what you think about them. It is all about listening and figuring out what they want. But what I think you're also, I think that process, working this process, is you're getting them to want to, you're modeling vulnerability, and you're getting them to want to be vulnerable, because there's a lot of times there's things that hide behind the surface. So I think that's brilliant and awesome.
I think that every manager's or leader's role should be to actually protect the people who are below them, right? We often joke about the poop umbrella, right? Like somebody should be able to protect the people below them from the upper components, right? So it's not just about helping.
When you say we've never joked about a poop umbrella.
No, well, I'm talking about people in the space and technology. But I think that like your job should be that the people below you feel comfortable and they feel protected, right? But the people above understand what your team is able to accomplish. So if they have needs that are going to make that are different or driving, it should not fall down to the individual. I feel like it should be up to the manager and the people who are in leadership to make sure that we're doing what is required without it feeling like upper management is unhappy about a thing or wants something different. So like it's about how you communicate, right? So like for me, one-on-ones are all about, so when I have a team who I'm responsible for, I tend to schedule one-on-ones on a weekly basis, and that one-on-one time between you and I, so say you were my manager, would be my time, right? Like as the person who's reporting to you, it is up to me to come to the table with the things I want to talk about. So things that are going well for me personally, things that aren't going well, things that are going well on the team, things that aren't going well. What is the culture? Is there a good culture going on? But that is the time where you have 30 minutes to an hour to actually talk about the things that are important to you. And as the manager, you should also be ready to hear about those things, right? So it should be things that are informing you about how to communicate upwards. So I am now taking the conversation that I have with everybody on my team, or you're having on your team, and you should be able to talk about that in your one-on-one with your manager. So you're distilling down, so they don't have to have one-on-ones all the way down the chain. You can come to the table and say, Robbie's having a problem this week because this technology is not actually working as we originally expected, so we're probably going to fall behind in this. Giving those honest, open conversations means that nobody's ever surprised, right? And that's what I love about like having one-on-ones on a weekly basis, is there's always an open communication channel. Like you and I could always have a conversation if I was reporting to you. Like I could send you a message, but I know once a week there's going to be an update time of like, this is what's going well, this is going sideways, this is the help I need, right? Like, and your job is to take all those things to also report up, but also help solve the problems horizontally. Like, is there something that's blocking me from being able to do the work that I need to do? And I feel like it's also about like understanding how the person communicates. Is the person an introvert or an extrovert? How do they feel confident, right? So it's a little bit about understanding how they talk and how they approach problems, but it's also about being able to take, sometimes to provide a voice to a person who's voiceless, because that's really important. There are people who are never going to speak up if there's something going wrong or sideways on the culture in a team, and they're not confident or comfortable doing it in public. So taking that and having conversations maybe with your manager about how to solve those problems. And
seeing there, like you can tell, like when's like, how are you doing? I'm fine. you can tell, like when you can read body language and you can kind of push, and it's like, seriously, like, that's where I think having a lot of emotional intelligence is really important.
So I think in the end, like, when you're listening, you also have to hear, right? Like, it's a combination of, like, in order for me to get you. So one of the things I think is important for teams is that, like, we generally on the ground level of a project are actually the execution arm all the way down the pipe from the CTO, right? So the CTO is actually taking the vision of a CEO and they're trying to execute that. So individual teams below the CTO are actually trying to execute the vision as brought down from the CTO. So helping CTOs establishing what the technologies are, they're establishing what we should be doing, and then the individual teams are, if you think about it, are actually executing and trying to accomplish that. My job is not to have an opinion, my job is to actually execute for the business. So I am okay with saying I don't know, or I am okay with saying I think there are people who have more technical experience with the thing we're working on. So I just want to make sure that we apply that to solve the tech problem. Right? So it's actually making sure that people also feel invested on the team. It's us, right? It's not my opinion, it's our opinion. So when I talk with people in one-on-ones, I talk about the things from my perspective, but I then ask them what their perspective is, and I allow that to inform how I talk about it. So I try really hard in those conversations to continue to model back how they're talking. So if somebody is disagreeing with me, asking them more questions, understanding why, seeing if it's going to affect my opinion, but also coming back at the end and saying this is like not, so they're not surprised in another meeting if I have not been influenced. Like I agree with what you're saying, but I don't think it applies in this case. I try really hard to close the loop in those conversations. So not just that, so they know they were heard and they know where I stand. Because I think the most important thing across most business is that no one is surprised. And I feel like one-on-ones are a great way to get across opinions, but it's also a really good time for you to be able to put a bow on it and say, this is where I stand after this conversation, and trying to get them to do the same thing. Because it's super important for everyone to feel like it was their opinion. Otherwise, we're basically dictating. I say all the time, I don't want you to be another set of my hands, right? We hire people because they have brains.
We're kind of at time. I wanted to keep this a little bit shorter, but there's so much good stuff, and we're speaking at hyperspeed. This is what happens when I've lived in New York and he's from New York, so this is just slow it down. You can control the pace. But going back to just very quickly, one of the things you said earlier, working with introverts and tech people tend to be very focused and want to just focus on the work. But I really liked what you said about pre-gaming, and I liked what you said about people not wanting to be surprised as a way to cultivate confidence. My personal experience is I have like thrown something in a meeting to somebody, expecting that they would be okay with talking because I knew that they were the expert on someone, and they were just like, oh my God, I can't believe you threw this at me. And I learned my lesson there quickly, not to surprise anyone. But you were talking about pre-gaming and back channeling. Can you just talk a little bit more about that? Because I thought it was such great stuff.
Yeah, so I realized recently when we went to an offsite for the USDS, we had a whole session about management styles, and we came to the fact there are like 4. One is data-driven, one is design-driven. So people design thinking, it's more about the vision and where we're going. Data about like how we get, what it is on the ground and what the data drives us to do. And then there are like the alpha personalities that tend to be the drivers of ideas, and they're all about execution. And then there's sort of the consensus builders. And I found that I often end up filling the role of the alpha in the personality conversation, but I do a ton of consensus building. So for me, it's all about like having a conversation and knowing where the team is. I don't like to go in. I also don't like to be surprised. So I often go into meetings knowing where I think the answer lies when I put out a question to the team. That's because I bring it up and talk about it in one-on-ones. So I make sure that their opinions are actually surfaced, and I allow it to inform where I think the team is going to go, and try really hard to be in a position to know what the answer is. So I will have conversations trying to build consensus before it comes up in a team meeting.
Okay, that's brilliant. So I think if you took nothing away from this talk, I think there's a lot of great stuff. And follow you on everything,
yes.
I guess.
If you just look for Robbie the Geek on the whole first page of results on Google.
Yeah, so thank you so much.
Yeah.
I guess shake hands. Okay, thanks.